Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits, carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. I arrived at Eel's Spine Island on a fog-choked morning, the sea around me churning like dark, molten glass. The boat's motor struggled against the tide, groaning under the weight of the mist. The ferryman barely spoke, his eyes fixed on the shadow of jagged rocks that cut the horizon like black teeth. He muttered a warning as we approached the rickety dock, but I barely caught his words. The air smelled of salt and decay, thick with the promise of storms that never truly arrived yet seemed to linger in the damp. The lighthouse rose from the cliffs ahead, taller than I had imagined, its stone walls darkened by centuries of wind and rain. Even from a distance it seemed alive, staring at me with silent purpose. I had come to be its keeper, to watch over the light that guided sailors and, I would soon learn, kept something else at bay. As we docked, the ferry groaned against the wooden pilings, the mist swallowing the boat, as if it had never been there at all. I stepped onto the weathered planks, each one creaking underfoot, and felt a chill seep into my bones that had nothing to do with the sea wind. Waiting for me on the dock was old Renner, the head keeper. His face was etched with lines deeper than the cracks in the lighthouse walls, eyes like gray stones that seemed to weigh every secret of the island. He offered no greeting, only a nod, and in his hands rested a weathered notebook bound with salt-stained leather. The title was embossed faintly, worn by time and moisture, 13 Rules to Keep the Light Burning. The rules were specific in ways that unsettled me immediately. They were not suggestions, they were instructions for survival, written in a hand that trembled as if it had been compelled by something unseen. Rule 1 cautioned against whistling after midnight. Another forbade looking at the sea when the horn sounded. One demanded the lower hatch storms. There was a rhythm to them, almost like a chant, each line shaping the day and night into rituals that I could not yet understand. The first night, the wind rose from the cliffs and carried with it sounds that the ferry never could have predicted. Scraping, dragging, deliberate, and patient. I told myself it was just the rocks shifting, the waves battering the foundations of the lighthouse. But deep down, I knew better. Rule 7 echoed in my mind, warning not to answer the knocking, no matter how human it sounded. I did not know yet who or what was knocking, but I felt it studying me, testing me. I pulled the blankets closer, trying to convince myself that the walls were enough to keep the dark at bay. Renner moved through the halls with a precision born of decades of habit. Each step, each turn, each glance was calculated. He spoke only in fragments, warnings that seemed to carry weight far beyond their words. He told me the light was not merely for guiding sailors. It was a barrier, a line drawn between the island and something far older and far hungrier in the depths below. That first night, I glimpsed a shadow through the fog beyond the cliffside, long and thin, stretching toward the lighthouse as if the rocks themselves had hands. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating, carrying with it whispers that made my skin crawl. I could hear the sea calling, though the waves seemed distant, too measured, too deliberate. Each gust of wind felt like a warning, brushing my neck like the touch of unseen fingers. The notebook lay open on the table, and I could not stop reading. The rules were becoming more than words. They were a map of survival in a place where even the light itself demanded respect. I spent hours walking the spiral stairs, inspecting the lamp and the lenses, noting every crack, every imperfection. The wind howled around the tower, and I imagined hands reaching from the mist to grasp at the stone. Old Renner had left for the lower decks, and I was alone. A soft tapping began at the door below, measured and insistent, each strike timed with the pulse of my own heartbeat. I remembered the rule again, the warning to ignore it. I forced myself to do nothing, standing frozen while the sound continued, growing bolder, closer, until it seemed to echo inside my skull rather than outside. The night stretched endlessly, each hour dragging with the weight of centuries. The light above burned steadily, a beacon not only to sailors but to those things that lingered just beyond the edge of sight. In that first night, I understood the truth that Renner had tried to convey without speaking. The lighthouse was more than stone and flame. It was a ward, a promise, a challenge to the darkness that watched and waited. And the rules, seemingly mundane, were not suggestions, but the only lifeline I had to survive until dawn. Morning came with a pale, washed-out light that barely penetrated the fog clinging to the cliffs. The sea below was an endless sheet of gray, motionless in some moments, violently heaving in others as if it were breathing with a mind of its own. I climbed the spiral stairs to inspect the light, checking the lenses and the brass fittings. Each piece was meticulously maintained, polished to a glow, yet somehow the air around it felt heavier than it should, as though the flame itself drew its strength from more than oil and wick. Old Renner emerged from the shadows at the top of the tower, his eyes scanning the horizon. He handed me a small, carved key and gestured toward a hatch at the base of the lighthouse. "Do not open this," he said, voice low and urgent. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried a weight that silenced all questions. The hatch was sealed with salt and rust, an iron barrier between the lighthouse and the darkness below. Yet even from above, I could hear a faint scratching beneath it, rhythmic and patient, almost as if something were trying to tell me it existed. Over the next days, I fell into the routines the rules demanded. Each morning I polished the lenses, trimmed the wick, and noted every crack or imperfection in the lantern room. Every night I ascended the stairs to tend the flame, ensuring it burned steadily. The foghorn, mounted on the cliffs, moaned at regular intervals, a low, mournful sound that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the island itself. Renner rarely spoke, only issuing occasional warnings. "It is never just the waves," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I began to understand that each rule was more than mere superstition. Rule 3 forbade signaling back to other lights at sea. Rule 6 instructed covering the windows during the new moon. Rule 9 insisted that if one keeper vanished, the other must continue as if nothing had changed. At first, they seemed like odd maritime traditions, precautions against isolation and fatigue. But slowly, I felt their necessity, the invisible threads they wove around the lighthouse to contain something ancient and relentless. One night, the fog rolled in heavier than ever, smothering the island in a gray, suffocating blanket. The lighthouse trembled under the gusts, and the sea clashed against the cliffs with the force of a battering ram. I heard the tapping again at the lower hatch, sharper now, as if whatever lived beneath had learned patience and cruelty simultaneously. My hands shook as I clutched the railing, remembering Rule 7. Do not answer the knocking, no matter how human it sounds. I pressed my ear to the hatch briefly and froze. The sound of scraping had changed. It had grown deliberate, patterned, almost like it was listening, learning the rhythm of my fear. By the third night, I started noticing things that were impossible. Shadows that moved against the direction of the flickering lamp. Shapes in the mist that vanished whenever I tried to focus on them. The fog carried whispers, soft at first, then urgent, calling names I did not recognize. I tried to dismiss them as wind or my imagination, but a cold certainty gnawed at me. The sea was alive with intent, and I was very much on its radar. Renner, in his few words, hinted at the island's history, speaking of keepers who had come before me and had disappeared without trace. Some vanished into the fog, others into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the cliffs, never to be seen again. He spoke of the lighthouse not as a building, but as a bulwark, a protective barrier between the living and what lay beneath the waves. And the rules were the contract, the ritual that kept that barrier from failing. One evening, as I ascended the stairs to tend the light, I noticed a faint glow far out in the distance. Another light, though no ship had been expected. My first instinct was to signal back, a reflex I could not entirely suppress. Renner appeared at my side without a sound. His hand on my shoulder was cold, steadying, and he said simply, "That is not a ship. It is them pretending." Fear seeped into my veins, icy and sharp. I looked at him, searching for any sign of jest, but found none. The shadows around him seemed to lean closer, and even the lighthouse walls felt tighter, more confining, as if they were aware that the boundary was being tested. That night, sleep eluded me. The fog pressed its face to the windows, whispering, tugging at the edges of my mind. The wind carried a scent that was not salt nor sea, but something older, something alive. Beneath the hatch, the scraping continued, learning, patient, relentless. The rules, once lines of ink in a book, now burned in my consciousness. Each word was a warning, a lifeline, a small piece of armor against what watched from the depths. I realized fully that the light above was not just guidance for sailors, but a line drawn in the darkness, and I, the keeper, had been chosen to maintain it, whether I wanted the responsibility or not. The nights on Eel's Spine Island grew heavier with each passing storm. The fog thickened until the cliffs and the sea beyond seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the lighthouse and its fragile beam of light. I began to notice patterns in the whispers that drifted through the mist. Sometimes they sounded like names, sometimes like half-formed warnings. There were moments when the wind carried words I could almost understand, urgent, pleading, yet always impossible to fully grasp. I understood then that the fog itself was alive, carrying fragments of voices, echoes of the past, and hints of something more. Old Renner never slept for long. He would appear at odd hours, moving silently through the corridors of the lighthouse, inspecting the flame, the lenses, the brass fittings, his hands steady and precise. I started following him at a distance, learning without asking. Each movement, each adjustment of the light, each careful turn of the crank that controlled the lens was a part of the ritual. I realized that the rules were not arbitrary. They were an inherited system of defenses, passed down from keeper to keeper for decades, maybe centuries, against something beyond reason or imagination. One night I dared to venture to the lower hatch despite the warnings. The metal was cold beneath my hands, the lock heavy and rusted, but the sound from beneath was irresistible. Scraping, dragging, breathing, a rhythm I could feel in my chest as much as hear with my ears. My mind screamed to obey Rule 7, to step back and pretend nothing existed below. Yet I lingered, my curiosity warring with my instinct to survive. And then, in that fleeting second, I glimpsed movement, a shadowed figure just below the hatch, pale and elongated. Barnacle-encrusted skin glinting in the light of the lamp above. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward. The figure did not move as humans do. It flowed, slid, as if it were part of the fog itself, testing the barrier, learning the rhythms of life above it. Renner appeared behind me without a sound, as if the shadow had not been there for him. He looked at me with eyes that were both warning and pity. "They are patient," he whispered. "They do not strike unless the rules are broken. You have almost broken them." I could not speak. I could only nod, understanding the weight of his words. The flame above burned steadily, defiant against the mist. Yet I realized with a shiver that it was not simply oil and fire keeping the darkness at bay. There was something older in the light, a force bound to the rhythm of the rules, and it demanded vigilance. The following days were a blur of endless maintenance. I polished the lenses until my hands ached, trimmed the wick, and checked the lantern room for any sign of weakness. Each day the fog thickened. The wind screamed with a voice that was not quite human, and the distant scraping beneath the hatch became almost melodic in its persistence. The island itself felt alive, sentient, watching. I began to notice shapes in the mist, long, thin forms that slithered just beyond the range of the light, retreating when I turned my gaze. There was intelligence in their movements, a deliberate patience, a knowing that chilled me more than any storm ever could. Old Renner shared fragments of history and whispers, tales of keepers who had vanished into the fog, some driven mad by the voices, others never seen again. One had opened the hatch, despite the rules, and the flame had faltered. The accounts were vague but terrifying, filled with hints of something emerging from the depths, something that claimed those who underestimated the vigilance required to maintain the barrier. Each story reinforced the weight of the notebook in my hand, each rule more sacred and terrifying than the last. By the time the first full moon rose over Eel's Spine Island, I began to understand the rhythm of life here. The fog was never just fog, the wind was never just wind, and the scraping beneath the hatch was never idle. The rules were not merely instructions, they were lifelines, contracts with a force older than the sea, older than the rocks themselves. Following them became a matter of instinct, muscle memory, and terror. Every step, every glance, every careful adjustment of the light was a prayer, a pact, a promise to survive until the dawn. And yet, as I stood at the top of the spiral stairs one evening, staring into the thick gray horizon, I felt it. The weight of eyes beneath the waves, waiting, patient, learning. The light above was my shield, and the rules were my armor, but I knew in the marrow of my bones that nothing about Eel's Spine Island was truly safe. I had arrived expecting solitude, duty, and perhaps a touch of the supernatural. What I had not expected was the understanding that survival here required more than skill, more than courage. It required obedience to forces that were older than humanity and respect for a darkness that would not forgive error. The first week passed in a blur of routine and whispered warnings. Each day, the fog, the wind, and the distant scraping reminded me that I was not alone, that the island itself was a sentinel as much as I was, bound to the flame, bound to the rules, and bound to the watchful eyes beneath the waves. I understood finally that this was only the beginning, that the true test of a keeper was not merely tending the light, but enduring the island's vigilance, respecting its secrets, and surviving the patience of the things that lurked just beyond sight. Night fell again, heavier than ever, and the fog pressed against the lighthouse like a living thing. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying whispers that I could almost understand. I had come to recognize certain patterns, sibilant sounds that mimicked voices, faint repetitions of my own name, the dragging scrape that echoed beneath the hatch. The island was alive in ways I could barely comprehend, and the rules, once strange and arbitrary, had become lifelines woven into every action I took. That night, the scraping beneath the hatch grew bolder. It was deliberate, methodical, like claws testing the iron barrier that separated me from whatever waited below. I held the railing, staring down at the sealed metal door, my heart hammering. The notebook rested open in front of me, pages fluttering in the wind as if urging me to remember every word, every injunction, every command that might mean the difference between life and death. Rule 7 resonated louder than ever. Do not answer the knocking, no matter how human it sounds. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise. But it had a rhythm that invaded every corner of my mind. Old Renner appeared at the top of the stairs, moving as silently as the shadows themselves. He did not speak at first, only watching, eyes narrowing at the hatch below. "They learn," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the building tension. "They watch every step, every choice. Every mistake is a lesson for them. Do not give them the chance to teach you." I nodded, swallowing hard, knowing that I could not retreat further than I already had. The lighthouse had become a cage and a sanctuary at once, and the weight of responsibility pressed against my chest with the inevitability of the tides. Hours passed with the fog swirling, thick and suffocating. I tended the light obsessively, checking every lens, adjusting the wick, ensuring that the flame burned steady and bright. The storm outside seemed to grow in intensity as if it could sense the vigilance within the tower. Thunder rolled from the cliffs, and the sea slammed against the rocks in a rhythm that seemed in time with my own pulse. Through it all, I could hear them beneath the hatch, scraping, dragging, patient, and impossibly intelligent. By the third night, I had begun to see shapes in the fog, slender, undulating forms moving just beyond the beam of the lighthouse. They did not flee when I shone the light directly at them. Instead, they paused, watching, calculating. The instinctive fear that had gripped me at first was now tempered by understanding. These were not mindless creatures. They were hunters, observers, waiting for the slightest break in protocol, the tiniest lapse in attention. Renner shared more of the island's history in fragments whispered through the night. Keepers who had failed the rules vanished without a trace, their names erased from memory as though they had never existed. The fog itself was a repository of their voices, caught between this world and the next, feeding the awareness of the creatures beneath the cliffs. Each rule, each ritual, each meticulous adjustment of the light was a shield against an intelligence older than humanity, older than the rocks themselves. One night, as I climbed the stairs to tend the lamp, I noticed a faint shimmer on the horizon, a light moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. My first impulse was to signal back, to respond to the apparent ship, but a cold hand of dread stopped me. Renner appeared silently at my side, placing his hand on my shoulder. "That is not a ship," he said, voice flat, certain. "It is them pretending." I understood in that instant the true terror of Eel's Spine Island. The dangers were not always visible. The threats did not always announce themselves. The light I tended was not merely guidance for sailors, but a boundary, a ward, a fragile line between safety and the depths of the unknown. I spent that night in a state between vigilance and exhaustion, listening to the scraping below, the whispering fog, the wind's mournful voice. The rules were no longer suggestions, they were survival. Every glance at the horizon, every adjustment of the flame, every echo of sound beneath the hatch was a reminder that the island did not belong to me, not fully. I was merely a caretaker, a temporary guardian of the barrier that kept something ancient, something patient, from rising and consuming all that I held dear. As the hours crawled toward dawn, I realized the truth that old Renner had tried to convey without words. Survival on Eel's Spine Island demanded respect, obedience, and humility before forces beyond comprehension. The lighthouse was a bulwark, the flame a shield, and the rules a covenant with the unseen. I had arrived expecting solitude and duty. What I found was a test that would challenge every instinct, every nerve, every shred of courage I possessed. The island watched, the fog listened, and beneath the waves, something waited. And I understood fully that my role as keeper was not just to maintain the light. It was to endure the vigilance of a darkness that would not forgive. The days on Eel's Spine Island settled into a rhythm dictated by the rules, a cadence that was both soothing and suffocating. The lighthouse demanded attention at every hour, and the fog that pressed constantly against the stone wall served as a reminder that I was never truly alone. Each rule in the notebook had a purpose, each line written with precision born of long experience. They were simple on the surface, but layered with meaning, guardians of a fragile line between the known and the unfathomable. Rule 1 forbade whistling after midnight. At first, it seemed absurd, a superstition born of boredom or isolation. Yet when the night came and the wind carried the fog's whispers, I realized the truth. Even a sound as trivial as a whistle could carry beyond the walls, beyond the beam of the lighthouse, and reach the eyes and ears of those waiting beneath the waves. The fog itself seemed to tense with sound, responding to the vibrations of air and stone. I learned quickly to move quietly, to speak in hushed tones, and to treat every step, every breath, as part of the ritual of survival. Rule 3 forbade signaling to other lights at sea. One evening, I noticed a faint glow flickering far beyond the horizon. My instinct urged me to flash the lantern in response, the simple reflex of a keeper trying to guide a vessel. Renner's hand on my shoulder froze me in place, and he whispered, eyes fixed on the horizon, that it was not a ship. That light belonged to the things below, to the watchers in the depths, testing, probing, learning. My hands trembled as I kept the light steady, refusing to communicate, refusing to acknowledge the illusion. The weight of the rule pressed on me, with the force of the tides themselves, and I realized obedience was a matter of life or death. Rule 6 demanded covering the windows during the new moon. At first, I treated it as precaution, a way to reduce glare or maintain warmth. But when the moon disappeared from view, the fog seemed to thicken, heavier and more deliberate. Shadows began to shift just beyond the glass, long and thin, curling with intent. I pulled the shutters closed, feeling the weight of their presence pressing against the wood. The fog's whispers grew fainter as the barrier went up, and I understood that the rule was not about light or sight. It was about controlling the exposure of the lighthouse itself, about hiding from something that studied, that mimicked, that waited for opportunity. Rule 9 was the one that gnawed at me the most. If a keeper disappeared, the other must continue as if nothing had changed. Renner had lived this truth, had survived nights when the scraping beneath the hatch had grown bolder, when shapes had glided in the fog as though studying, waiting for the moment of weakness. I watched him perform his duties with calm precision, and I understood the stakes. Any lapse could unravel the protections, could allow the watchers below to breach the barrier. The rules were not suggestions. They were contracts, strict and unyielding, enforced by forces older and more patient than any human reckoning. Days and nights blurred into one another as I learned the rhythm of the lighthouse. The spiral stairs became familiar under my hands, the brass fittings polished until they shone, the flame above a living presence that required constant attention. The foghorn's mournful cries marked time, each bellow a reminder that the island itself was a sentient entity, observing, judging, enforcing. I began to anticipate the patterns of wind and tide, the subtle shifts in the mist, the way shadows move just beyond the light's reach. Each rule became instinct, etched into muscle memory, an unconscious defense against the unknown. And yet as the day stretched on, the strain of isolation began to reveal itself. The whispers grew bolder, forming fragments of words I could almost understand. Sometimes they called my name. Other times they seemed to chant in a language that was older than any I knew. The scraping beneath the hatch became rhythmic, deliberate, as if counting, measuring, learning. I understood that every movement I made, every glance toward the horizon, was observed, cataloged, remembered. The rules were not just protections. They were the only means of survival against intelligence older than the stones, older than the sea itself. I spent hours walking the top of the spiral stairs, hands gripping the railing, eyes on the horizon. Shapes emerged from the fog, pale and elongated, retreating when I met their gaze but never disappearing entirely. I felt their awareness, a sentient patience that chilled me to the bone. Renner had warned me of this. The Watchers were not mindless creatures. They were students of the Lighthouse, of the keepers of the rules. Each lapse, each error, each moment of hesitation would be remembered, cataloged, and eventually tested. The fog, the sea, the scraping below, all were components of a test I was only beginning to understand. As I studied the horizon, I noticed movement beyond the cliffs, a subtle undulation, a shimmer in the gray expanse of water. My heart leapt, instinct urging me to signal the lantern, to make contact, but the rules screamed in my mind. I remained still, hands steady on the railing, flame above unwavering. Renner appeared silently behind me, his gaze as sharp as a hawk's. "It is never a ship," he said, voice low, certain. "They are learning. Never respond." The weight of obedience settled on my shoulders, heavier than any storm that had battered the island since I arrived. Survival here was not measured in strength or courage, but in patience, in vigilance, and in the unwavering adherence to the rules that bound the lighthouse and its keepers, to the fragile line between light and the unseen darkness. As the days turned into a rhythm of fog and flame, I began to understand that each rule was tied not only to survival, but to a delicate balance of power within the lighthouse. Rule 2 instructed us never to leave the lantern room unattended during storms. It was simple on paper, yet the reasoning became terrifyingly clear the first night a gale ripped through the cliffs. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the rain pounded the stone walls with the persistence of something alive. I felt the lantern tremble in its mount, as if the flame itself sensed the approach of forces beyond understanding. My hand shook as I tended it, adjusting the lens with painstaking care. One momentary lapse, 1 second of distraction, could have invited the darkness closer. Rule 5 forbade striking the foghorn more than 3 times in a single hour. At first, it seemed precautionary, a way to avoid exhausting the mechanism. But when I violated it accidentally one morning, the response was immediate and unnerving. The scraping beneath the hatch accelerated, more urgent, more insistent, and the fog outside thickened as if it were a living, breathing entity closing in on the lighthouse. Shapes flickered, just beyond the light's reach, moving with deliberate awareness. Renner's eyes met mine across the room, and without a word, I understood the gravity of my mistake. The fog was not idle, and the watchers below the waves were always ready to exploit error. Rule 8 instructed that the lower deck remain undisturbed except in emergencies. The hatch that led to it had been sealed with layers of salt and iron, yet curiosity gnawed at me. One evening, drawn by the faint whispers that seemed almost human, I approached it. The scraping beneath had paused, as if it were waiting for my decision. I pressed my hand to the hatch and felt vibrations, subtle yet insistent, like a heartbeat in the stone. I remembered Renner's warning, the unspoken truths behind every rule, and I stepped back. The rules were a map of boundaries, lines drawn in stone and flame to protect not just the keepers, but the island itself from the intelligence that lurked beneath the cliffs. The whispers in the fog became more structured over time, forming fragments of sentences, small demands, and eerie imitations of my own voice. At first, I tried to ignore them, attributing them to wind and imagination. But soon I realized they were testing me, learning the limits of my attention, my obedience and my fear. They whispered about the light, about the flame, about the careful rituals we followed. They mimicked the very instructions I had learned, creating confusion and doubt. I understood then that the Watchers were not mindless creatures. They were students of our routines, always observing, always measuring, always waiting for a single lapse that could unravel the fragile defenses we maintained. Rule 10 warned never to speak to voices that came from the sea or the fog. The first time I heard my own name called in a whisper carried by the wind, my instinct was to answer, to assure myself that it was only imagination. Renner's hand on my shoulder froze me in place, and I felt the cold certainty of his gaze. The rules were there to enforce distance, to maintain the boundary between the known world and the unseen intelligence below. Speaking, even in curiosity, was dangerous. It could draw attention, teach them our patterns, and invite the darkness closer. I held my tongue, heart hammering, as the whispers circled the lighthouse, growing louder, then fading as if satisfied that I had obeyed. I began to notice subtle changes in the fog's behavior as I followed the rules meticulously. Shapes emerged and disappeared with precision, timing their movements to coincide with my own actions. The scraping beneath the hatch became a rhythmic accompaniment to my work, like a metronome marking the passage of time and testing my discipline. Each rule, each habit, each small act of obedience strengthened the barrier that separated us from what lay beneath. The lighthouse was a living entity, a sentinel bound to flame and stone, and we were its guardians. Even as I mastered the routines, exhaustion crept in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The isolation was oppressive, the fog relentless, and the Watchers patient beyond comprehension. Yet every time I tended the flame, polished the lenses, or followed the rules to the letter, I felt a fragile sense of control, a fleeting assurance that the barrier held. Obedience was not optional here. It was survival, discipline, and reverence combined, a ritual that had protected keepers for generations. The days and nights on Eel's Spine Island began to blur into one long vigil, measured only by the relentless rhythm of the flame above and the low, mournful wail of the foghorn. I moved through the lighthouse with an almost mechanical precision, each motion dictated by the rules, each glance and gesture calibrated against the threats that hovered beyond the reach of light. The fog had grown denser, more purposeful, pressing against the walls and windows as if it were aware of every step, every sound, every heartbeat. Rule 4 instructed keepers never to leave the lantern room without leaving the flame in a steady, controlled state. The first night I violated it accidentally. The wind howled like the wails of the drowned, and the scraping beneath the hatch escalated into a frenzy. Shadows emerged in the fog, elongated and sinuous, moving as though learning the weaknesses in my routine. Renner's gaze was a dagger of quiet admonition. Even the smallest lapse matters. The Watchers take note. They adapt. They test. Obedience is survival. I understood then that these rules were not for our comfort, but for our very existence, the thin line between safety and the abyss. Rule 11 forbade any keeper from sleeping more than a single hour at a stretch during fog-heavy nights. Fatigue was a weapon the island wielded as effectively as the scraping and the whispers. I followed the rule religiously, pacing the spiral stairs, polishing lenses, tending the wick, and checking the lantern over and over, my body a vessel for relentless vigilance. The fog seemed to pulse in response, thickening around the windows, sending cold, wet fingers into every corner of the lighthouse. Every glance at the horizon, every turn of the crank that rotated the lens was a prayer, a ritual of survival. The Watchers in the fog became more active as my routines became more disciplined. At first they were subtle, shadows flitting beyond the lantern's beam, whispers curling in my ears with impossible precision. Over time they grew bolder, slithering closer to the windows, dragging along the cliffs, brushing against the lower walls in rhythms that mimicked my own movements. I could feel their awareness, patient and intelligent, cataloging my every action, testing the boundaries of obedience. The rules were our shield, and they measured it constantly, searching for a crack, a moment of weakness, a single deviation from the strict pattern. Rule 12 warned keepers never to acknowledge the presence beneath the hatch, never to tempt them with a curiosity or voice. The scraping grew louder when I dared to linger near it, rhythmic and deliberate, almost mocking. I pressed my hands to the railings, heart hammering, and forced myself to focus on the flame, the lens, the light above. The watchers were learning, patient and relentless. Each rule reinforced the boundaries. Each repetition strengthened the barrier. And each violation invited the fog and the things beneath the cliffs to grow bolder, to test, to probe. Renner moved through the lighthouse like a shadow of certainty, demonstrating the rules without explanation, his obedience a lesson I could barely keep pace with. "They are not mindless," he said one night, voice quiet over the wail of the wind. "They learn, they adapt, they wait. The rules are not for our convenience. They are the only thing keeping them from coming up through the hatch, through the fog, into the light." I understood that survival required more than following instructions. It required understanding the intent behind them, feeling the pulse of the lighthouse and the watchers, learning to anticipate the movements of forces that were not bound by human comprehension. By the end of the first week, the lighthouse had begun to shape my mind, my senses, and my perception of reality. I could predict the way the fog shifted against the windows, anticipate the scraping beneath the hatch, and sense the subtle undulations of shapes in the mist. The rules were no longer lines of ink in a book. They were a rhythm, a pattern, a covenant, with something far older than the stones, the sea, or the flame. My life, my sanity, and the fragile balance that kept the darkness at bay depended entirely on my adherence to them. Even as exhaustion gnawed at my mind, I felt the satisfaction of keeping the light burning, of fulfilling the duties laid out into the notebook. The watchers retreated when I performed each task correctly, patient in their observation, biding their time for any lapse. I realized that mastery of the rules was more than survival. It was communion with the lighthouse itself, understanding its purpose, its vigilance, and its relationship with the dark intelligence that lingered in the depths. The fog thickened as the days turned into nights, a living, breathing entity pressing relentlessly against the lighthouse walls. The scraping beneath the hatch became more insistent, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo the beat of my own heart. Every rule in the notebook had become an instinct, a muscle memory. Yet the presence beneath the waves remained patient, waiting for a single misstep. I understood that the watchers were not merely creatures. They were intelligent, calculating, and older than the stones themselves. Rule 13 was the most ominous of all. Never, under any circumstances, extinguish the flame. Its purpose was obvious only after a night when the wind rose in a frenzy, threatening to snuff the lamp. The flame was more than light. It was a barrier, a bond, a line drawn between the living and whatever waited below the hatch. I fought against the gusts, hand on the wick, eyes on the rotating lenses, and I felt the weight of the rules pressed down harder than ever before. One momentary failure could have allowed the watchers to breach the line, to rise through the fog, and to claim the lighthouse as their own. On that night, shapes moved in the fog with a boldness I had not seen before. Long, undulating forms slithered along the cliffs, reaching toward the windows, lingering in the spaces between shadows and light. The scraping beneath the hatch grew frenetic, as if it had learned my every motion and now sought to test the boundaries of my vigilance. I pressed my hands to the railing, breath caught, feeling the pulse of fear that came with the knowledge that the watchers were patient, intelligent, and relentless. Obedience was not a choice. It was survival, discipline, and reverence combined in a fragile rhythm, dictated by centuries of keepers who had walked this same path before me. Renner appeared silently behind me, a presence both comforting and terrifying. He did not speak at first, only watching as I tended the lamp with meticulous care. "The rules are not suggestions," he said finally, voice low and certain. "They are the only things keeping them at bay. Any lapse, any deviation, even a moment of hesitation, can undo everything." His gaze swept the fog, assessing the unseen watchers, and I felt the weight of his experience pressing down. He had endured years of vigilance, nights when the scraping beneath the hatch had grown deafening, and mornings when the fog seemed to carry voices of keepers long vanished. As the nights wore on, I began to feel the psychological toll of life on the island. Fatigue gnawed at my mind, isolation pressed in, like the fog itself, and the whispers of the watchers became more structured, more deliberate, almost conversational. They mimicked voices, imitated footsteps, and repeated fragments of the rules back to me. I realized that they were learning, measuring my resolve, cataloging my actions, waiting for an error to exploit. Every movement I made, every glance at the horizon, every adjustment of the flame became a ritual of survival, a negotiation with forces beyond comprehension. There were moments when the isolation became unbearable. Shadows would cling to the corners of my vision, and the fog would swirl in patterns that suggested intent. The scraping beneath the hatch would quicken, a staccato reminder that I was being observed, tested, and understood. Yet through all of this, I discovered a strange rhythm, a fragile sense of communion with the lighthouse and its light. The rules were not burdens, they were shields, lines of defense against the patient intelligence that hovered beneath the waves, watching, learning, waiting. One night, as I ascended the spiral stairs to tend the flame, a new sound emerged from the fog, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone of the lighthouse itself. The watchers had learned patience, and now they tested endurance. I felt the pulse of the lighthouse in response, the warmth of the flame above, the subtle weight of the rules guiding my hands and eyes. I understood fully that the flame, the rules, and my vigilance were intertwined. To maintain the light was to maintain the line, and to falter, even for a heartbeat, was to invite the abyss closer. By the end of the second week, the lessons of the rules had become inseparable from my survival. Every movement, every glance, every measured breath was a part of the covenant that kept the watchers at bay. The fog whispered, the scraping continued, and the shapes in the mist shifted in deliberate anticipation, yet the flame burned steadily above. I had come to understand that life on Eel Spine Island was a delicate balance of vigilance, obedience, and respect for forces older than time. The lighthouse was not just a beacon for sailors, it was a sentinel, a ward, a line of defense against intelligence that would not forgive mistakes. I realized then, as I stood at the top of the spiral stairs, hands steady on the railing, eyes fixed on the fog-laden horizon, that the rules were more than words on a page. They were survival. They were understanding. They were communion with the unseen. To break them was to invite the watchers closer. To follow them was to endure, to protect, and to maintain the fragile boundary between the living and what lurked beneath the waves. I had learned the true purpose of the rules, and I knew that the line I maintained was the thinnest but most important one between life and the patient, watching darkness. The fog on Eel Spine Island was never just mist. It was a living presence, an observer, a slow, patient force that moved with intent. Each morning, it would creep across the cliffs, curling in tendrils around the lighthouse, pressing against windows and walls as if it were feeling for the flame, testing the barrier that separated the living from the watchers beneath. I learned to anticipate its movements, to listen to these subtle changes in its density and rhythm, and to respect the silent intelligence that lurked within. By the third week, I had become attuned to its patterns. The fog would thicken just before the scraping beneath the hatch increased, as if signaling that the watchers were awake, aware, and observing. Shadows would form in the mist, elongated and fluid, never fully defined, always just beyond the reach of the lantern's beam. They seemed to follow me, testing my obedience, reminding me that the rules were not suggestions, but the only line of defense. I felt them as much as I saw them, a pressure on my senses, a tug at the edges of consciousness that could not be ignored. Rule 1, the prohibition against whistling after midnight, took on new significance in the presence of the fog. Any sound carried far, twisting, bending within its dense folds. A careless breath, a shift of clothing, even the softest whisper could travel through the mist and reach the watchers, drawing their attention. One night I had unconsciously hummed a fragment of a tune from home. The response was immediate. The scraping beneath the hatch quickened, and the fog outside thickened, pressing so close against the windows that I could no longer see the cliffs beyond. I froze, hands gripping the railing, heart hammering, and felt the weight of vigilance settle like a stone in my chest. The watchers beneath the hatch were patient, but they were not idle. Over the following nights, I began to notice subtle patterns in the fog's behavior, movements that seemed coordinated with the scraping and with shapes that occasionally glided along the cliffs. It became clear that the fog was a medium, a tool through which the watchers observed and tested. They were learning my rhythms, my responses, the habits that had formed during my time as keeper. The rules were the only shield, each one a barrier against the encroaching intelligence that studied me so closely. Rule 6, covering the windows during the new moon, revealed itself as more than precaution. During those nights, the fog outside became nearly solid, thick with intent, pressing against the barriers I had placed. Shapes moved within it, faint forms that mimicked human motion, moving with deliberate patience, gliding just beyond the glass. The watchers were assessing the strength of my defenses, the reliability of my obedience, and the stability of the flame above. I felt their awareness as palpably as I felt the wind against my skin, a silent pressure that demanded compliance, attention, and vigilance. One particularly dense night, the fog pressed so close against the lighthouse that I could no longer discern where the cliffs ended and the sea began. The scraping beneath the hatch became a rapid, staccato rhythm, almost musical in its persistence. I tried to focus on the flame, adjusting the lens and trimming the wick, but a sense of being watched pervaded every movement. Shadows emerged within the mist, slithering shapes that moved in time with the scratching. I understood fully then that the watchers were not passive. They were students of the lighthouse, observers of the rules, and masters of patience. The fog had a voice, subtle at first, soft and indistinct. I began to hear fragments of words carried on the wind, whispers that seemed almost human. They repeated fragments of my own thoughts, mimicked instructions I had spoken aloud, and sometimes offered warnings in a language I did not recognize. The intelligence within the mist was methodical, deliberate, and unyielding. Rule 10, the prohibition against speaking to voices in the fog became a lifeline. Any acknowledgement, any attempt to answer, could teach the watchers, give them insight into my intentions, and invite them closer. As I moved through the lighthouse, I felt the fog pressing against every surface, intruding through cracks in the walls, curling around my ankles, brushing my face. It was alive in ways I could neither fully understand nor ignore. Every shift in its density, every subtle movement, every whisper carried intention. The watchers beneath the hatch were learning, yes, but the fog itself was the medium of their study. the conduit through which they assessed, tested, and waited. I realized then that survival was not merely about tending the flame. It was about understanding the rhythm of the fog, the intelligence it carried, and the patience of those who lurked just beyond the hatch. As the nights grew longer, the fog became an even more insistent presence, curling into every corner of the lighthouse, slipping beneath doors and through the cracks of the windows. It was no longer just a shroud over the cliffs. It was a living observer, shaping the very air around me. Its movements were deliberate, timed with my own routines, rising and falling in intensity depending on my attention to the flame, my adherence to the rules, and the smallest deviations in my actions. I began to understand that the fog was an extension of the watchers, an active participant in their patient surveillance. Rule 5, limiting the use of the foghorn, became critically clear one night when a storm rolled in. I had miscalculated and sounded the horn one too many times in a short stretch. Immediately, the fog outside thickened to an almost solid gray, pressing in as if it were a living thing, smothering the light and echoing every sound back into the tower with unnatural clarity. The scraping beneath the hatch accelerated, urgent and precise, as if counting my heartbeat against its own rhythm. Shadows twisted in the mist, moving in patterns that mimicked my gestures, my pacing, and my very breathing. I realized that even a small infraction could teach the watchers, could allow them to anticipate my movements, to probe weaknesses in my vigilance. The whispers in the fog became more structured, more intentional. They were no longer random fragments of sound, but repetitions of phrases I had spoken aloud, imitations of commands I had given the flame, and sometimes warnings that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I could not discern if these voices belonged to the watchers, to past keepers who had vanished, or to the fog itself. Rule 10, forbidding any acknowledgement of the voices, became my lifeline. Speaking, even to test the sound or verify its origin, would have been catastrophic. I learned to steel myself against the compulsion to answer, to ignore the whispers as if they were an extension of the wind rather than a threat in themselves. One night, the fog behaved differently. It did not swirl as usual. It did not press against the windows in measured rhythms. Instead, it formed thick columns outside, like fingers reaching toward the lighthouse. And within those shapes, I thought I saw faint glimmers, reflections that moved in synchronization with my own steps. I held the railing, heart pounding, and felt the pressure of its awareness. The scraping beneath the hatch became a staccato rhythm, like a drum marking my heartbeat. I understood then that the watchers had learned more than patience. They had learned observation, and the fog was their instrument, their eyes, their communication with whatever intelligence lay beneath the cliffs. The strain of vigilance began to gnaw at me. Fatigue became a physical presence, a weight pressing against my limbs, dulling my senses, and making the whispers sharper, more intrusive. Shapes in the fog twisted just beyond the light, sometimes stretching along the cliffs, sometimes hovering near the windows, always watching. I could feel their intelligence pressing against my awareness, measuring my reactions, cataloging my behavior, and testing my ability to maintain the rules. Every glance, every movement, every adjustment of the flame was scrutinized, and the slightest lapse would have been enough to invite the watchers closer. Rule 12, forbidding any interference with the lower hatch, was a constant challenge to my curiosity. Every night, the scraping grew more complex, rhythmic, almost like a message in a code I could not yet decipher. Shadows flickered below the hatch as if they were practicing, anticipating, or communicating with the watchers above. I felt the pull of temptation, the need to understand what lay beneath, yet the rules held me back. Even a single breach could unravel the fragile defenses we maintain, and I knew that patience and obedience were more critical than any knowledge I might gain. As the fog pressed closer each night, I began to notice subtle, almost imperceptible changes in its behavior. Sometimes it would form concentric circles around the lighthouse, testing the boundaries of the light. Sometimes it would thicken suddenly in one corner, as if trying to distract me, to lure my attention from the flame, to measure my response. I realized that survival was no longer about maintaining routines alone. It was about reading the fog, sensing its intent, and responding not with fear, but with disciplined awareness. The watchers below were patient, but the fog carried their intelligence, their attention, and their unyielding assessment of every action I took. The nights on Eel's Spine Island grew heavier as the fog pressed more insistently against the lighthouse, no longer a mere shroud, but a tangible, conscious presence. I could feel it curling along the walls, seeking the warmth of the flame, probing the cracks in the stone, testing every barrier we had erected. The scraping beneath the hatch became almost musical in its rhythm, punctuated by pauses that seemed deliberate, as if the watchers were studying not just my movements, but my patience. Every glance, every step, every breath carried weight. The fog had become a mirror of vigilance, reflecting my fears, my discipline, and my exhaustion back at me. Rule 8, the prohibition against disturbing the lower hatch, proved to be the greatest test of all. One night, drawn by the unusual intensity of the scraping, I descended to the landing just above it. The metal door vibrated under my hand as if it were alive. Shadows flickered beneath, twisting in the ways that defied comprehension. I remembered Renner's warning. The hatch is not a portal to knowledge. It is a boundary for survival. I stepped back, heart hammering, and felt the fog press closer as if sensing my hesitation. The watchers did not strike, but their presence was undeniable, a patient and intelligent force waiting for a breach, a single lapse in discipline. The fog began to carry whispers that were no longer fragmented, no longer imitations of sound, but intentional communications. Names of keepers long vanished, phrases from forgotten rituals, and words that seemed to form warnings I could not fully understand. Rule 10, the prohibition against responding, became my lifeline. One false word, one acknowledgement of the voices, could have invited them closer, taught them the nuances of human fear, and made the line between safety and oblivion perilously thin. I held my tongue, eyes fixed on the flame above, hands trembling as the fog pressed its will against the walls, against my mind, against the rhythm of my breath. I began to notice subtle movements within the mist, elongated forms that glided along the cliffs, sometimes stopping to observe, sometimes retreating, always just beyond the beam of the lantern. They were intelligent, patient, and calculated, learning my pattern, testing my attention, and marking the moments when I faltered. Even the wind seemed to carry intent, howling with a cadence that matched the scraping below, echoing the pulse of anticipation. Each night was a lesson in vigilance, obedience, and understanding that survival required more than adherence to rules. It demanded communion with the lighthouse, the flame, and the fog itself. The strain of constant attention gnawed at my body and mind. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. Fatigue pressed on my limbs with the weight of stone, and the whispers tested my resolve at every turn. Shapes in the fog stretched and twisted along the cliffs, shadowed hands brushing against the walls, subtle vibrations beneath the floorboards signaling the presence of watchers beneath the hatch. The intelligence in the fog was relentless, observing and recording, waiting for any lapse to exploit. Rule 11, limiting sleep, became both punishment and protection, a constant reminder that the vigilance of the flame had to remain unbroken. One night a storm rolled in, battering the lighthouse with a fury I had not previously experienced. The fog thickened to near impenetrable density, pressing like liquid against the walls, and the scraping beneath the hatch became a rapid, urgent rhythm. Shadows moved in the mist with deliberate awareness, gliding closer to the windows, reaching for the light, testing its strength and my discipline. I tended the flame with precise care, trimming the wick, rotating the lens, and holding my breath as the fog pressed inward, a living, patient intelligence probing for weakness. Rule 13, the prohibition against extinguishing the flame, became the most sacred of all. The watchers below, the fog above, and the unseen intelligence that lingered in the cliffs were united in a single purpose: to test, to observe, to learn. Any lapse could have been fatal, any mistake could have allowed the barrier to falter, and yet I endured. The lighthouse was no longer merely a building. It was a sentinel, a living guardian of fragile boundaries, and the flame was the covenant that bound keepers to the rules, to each other, and to the ancient intelligence that waited in patient silence. By the end of that stormy night, I understood fully the role of the rules. They were not arbitrary, not mere tradition, not suggestions for safety. They were survival, discipline, and communion with forces beyond comprehension. The watchers beneath the hatch were patient, the fog was aware, and the flame was the fragile line of defense. I had learned to read the fog, anticipate the movements of shadows, and endure the whispers without faltering. Every breath, every glance, every measured step became part of the covenant, the rhythm that maintained the fragile boundary between life and the intelligent, patient darkness that surrounded the lighthouse. The fog grew heavier as the nights wore on, dense and suffocating, pressing against the lighthouse with an intent that could no longer be ignored. It carried an awareness, a deliberate consciousness that seemed to study my every movement, my every breath, my every heartbeat. Shapes shifted within it, elongated and indistinct, sometimes gliding along the cliffs, sometimes hovering just beyond the lantern's beam. The scraping beneath the hatch became a precise rhythm, a counting, a measurement of my vigilance. The watchers were no longer passive observers. They were students, patient and unyielding, learning my habits, testing my limits, and marking every deviation. One evening I noticed a new pattern. The fog would curl outward from the cliffs, then suddenly retreat, forming a swirling vortex around the lighthouse, as if drawing a boundary of its own design. Shadows danced within that vortex, stretching toward the windows, then withdrawing. The scraping beneath the hatch synchronized with these movements, as though the watchers were coordinating, studying my response, and adapting to my every instinct. I understood then that the fog was not merely a shroud. It was a sentient instrument, an extension of the intelligence beneath the cliffs, and I had to learn to move with it, anticipate it, respect it, or risk its silent, patient wrath. Rule 7, which forbade answering the tapping or scraping in any form, had become the hardest to obey. There were nights when the rhythm beneath the hatch seemed almost human, deliberate in a way that mimicked curiosity, urgency, even impatience. The temptation to respond, to investigate, to test whether my perception was accurate, gnawed at me. But every time I resisted, the fog seemed to recoil slightly, and the scraping slowed, almost in recognition of my discipline. I realized that obedience was both shield and ritual. To acknowledge the watchers was to teach them. To ignore them was to survive. The whispers in the fog grew clearer, more structured, and yet remained unintelligible. They formed sentences that teased understanding, phrases that mimicked the instructions I had muttered aloud, and fragments that seemed like warnings or threats. My mind strained to decipher them, but I had learned through bitter experience that attempting to communicate, even in curiosity, would invite disaster. The watchers measured attention, patience, and the ability to endure without faltering. Every violation, every hesitation was recorded, cataloged, and would eventually be tested again. One night, as a storm descended over the cliffs, the fog thickened to an almost tangible density, pressing through the shutters, curling around the spiral staircase, and seeping into every crack. Shadows moved in concert, gliding in patterns that seemed to anticipate my actions, brushing against the walls, brushing against me. I held the railing with hands slick from rain and sweat, eyes fixed on the flame above, and felt the weight of the watcher's intelligence pressing in, patient, unyielding, and calculating. The scraping beneath the hatch became a furious rhythm, demanding attention, testing the limits of my endurance, and reminding me that the rules were absolute. The candle flame in the lantern rotated, steady and unwavering, the only constant against the chaos of wind, fog, and unseen intelligence. I understood fully then that the light was not just guidance for sailors, but a fragile line of defense, a covenant with forces older than memory itself. Every adjustment of the wick, every rotation of the lens, every glance toward the horizon was a small act of defiance, discipline, and survival. The fog, the scraping, the whispers, they were constant reminders of what lay beyond comprehension and the consequences of failure. By the fourth week, the rhythms of the fog, the scraping, and the flame had become intertwined with my own heartbeat. I could anticipate the movement of shadows, sense the pressure of the fog against the walls, and feel the rhythm of the watchers beneath the hatch as though it were a pulse in the stone itself. Survival required total immersion, absolute focus, and unwavering adherence to the rules. The fog taught me patience, obedience, and the delicate art of endurance. Each night was a lesson, each whisper a test, and each shadow a reminder that life on Eel's Spine Island was a negotiation with an intelligence that would not forgive. As I stood at the top of the spiral stairs, hands gripping the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon, the watchers below paused, and the fog seemed to hang motionless for a moment. The scraping beneath the hatch slowed, deliberate, almost contemplative, and I understood the fragile equilibrium that had been established. The fog, the watchers, the flame, and the rules were all parts of a single mechanism, a covenant older than memory itself, and my life depended on maintaining it perfectly. Any lapse could unravel it, and any hesitation could invite disaster. I felt the weight of centuries of keepers in that moment, a chain of vigilance stretching backward through time, and I knew that my survival, the survival of the lighthouse, and the integrity of the boundary itself depended entirely on my obedience, patience, and understanding of the fog that whispered. The 13th Rule was always spoken of in whispers among keepers, a rule that carried the weight of centuries and the silent authority of every light that had ever burned atop the cliffs of Eel's Spine Island. Never extinguish the flame, the notebook read. Yet those words barely captured the terror and precision demanded by its practice. The flame was more than light. It was the line that separated the living from the watchers, the anchor of the covenant, the fragile barrier against the intelligence that lingered beneath the waves. One misstep could unravel everything. By the fourth week, I had learned to sense the presence of the watchers, even before they became visible. The fog pressed closer to the lighthouse, curling in deliberate patterns, thickening in certain corners, retreating in others, as if it had intelligence, as if it had thought and intent. The scraping beneath the hatch was no longer random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat counting my actions, measuring my vigilance, marking my compliance with the rules. Every movement I made, every breath I took, every rotation of the lantern lens became part of a ritual of survival, a covenant with forces older than any living memory. The nights had grown longer, the storms more frequent, and the fog more insistent. I learned to anticipate the changes, to read the subtle shifts in pressure, temperature, and light, and to respond with precision. Even the smallest lapse, a hesitation while trimming the wick, a misstep on the spiral stairs, a glance toward a shadow in the fog, was catalogued by the watchers. Were patient, calculating, and unyielding, testing me, probing my endurance, and waiting for a single lapse that could breach the fragile boundary I had come to understand as life itself. Rule 13, the 13th Rule, was the ultimate test. It demanded more than obedience. It demanded understanding, communion, and absolute vigilance. One evening, a storm rose with unnatural speed, and the fog closed in like a living wall. The scraping beneath the hatch quickened, urgent, deliberate, testing my focus. Shadows moved in patterns that mirrored my own, circling the lighthouse in silent observation. My hands were steady on the railing, eyes locked on the flame above, but the weight of exhaustion pressed in, threatening to disrupt the fragile equilibrium. I realized in that moment that the 13th Rule was not just a rule. It was the covenant that bound the lighthouse, the flame, the watchers, and the keepers together in a delicate balance of life and oblivion. The watchers beneath the hatch were patient, but their intelligence was undeniable. The scraping evolved into patterns, into rhythms, into sequences that seemed almost deliberate, almost communicative. I could feel them learning, measuring, testing. The fog itself became a medium for their observation, thickening in some places, thinning in others, wrapping around the lighthouse in deliberate patterns. Even the wind seemed to carry intent, howling in time with the scraping, echoing the pressure of unseen eyes. The flame was my anchor, the 13th Rule my covenant, and I understood that failure was not an option. I began to notice subtle changes in my own perception. The fog seemed to whisper directly to my mind, fragments of sound coalescing into faint messages, half-understood warnings, almost human in rhythm, but foreign in language. Rule 10 forbade responding, and I obeyed, though it took every ounce of will to resist the compulsion to answer, to acknowledge the intelligence pressing against my senses. Each time I resisted, I felt a small pulse of relief, a recognition that the watchers understood I would not falter. Each time I faltered even slightly, the fog and the scraping adjusted, testing the boundaries of my attention, my endurance, and my understanding of the covenant that kept the lighthouse and its keepers safe. On nights of heavy storm, the flame above became the singular focus of my existence. The spiral stairs blurred beneath my feet as I moved with instinctual precision, checking the wick, rotating the lenses, trimming and tending as if my life depended on it, which, in truth, it did. The watchers were everywhere at once, beneath the hatch, within the fog, reflected in the shadows on the walls, and yet nowhere to be fully seen. Their patience was absolute, their intelligence relentless, and their presence undeniable. Rule 13 demanded I maintain the flame not only with my hands, but with my mind, with my attention, and with every shred of endurance my body could muster. Even Renner, who had guided keepers through decades of storms, whispers, and scraping beneath the hatch, spoke of the 13th Rule with a reverence that bordered on fear. "It is not enough to tend the flame," he said once, voice low and steady over the howl of wind. "You must live within it, breathe it, become it." The watchers learn quickly, but the flame and the rules are stronger if your mind is steady. One mistake, one lapse, and everything the lighthouse has protected will fail. Those words, spoken quietly in the shadow of the fog, haunted me more than any storm, more than any whisper, more than the scraping beneath the hatch. The nights became a blur of fog, wind, and the relentless pulse of the scraping beneath the hatch. Every step on the spiral stairs, every adjustment of the flame, every measured breath was an exercise in obedience, endurance, and awareness. The 13th Rule was no longer simply words in a notebook. It was a rhythm, a covenant, a line etched into the very stones of the lighthouse. Any lapse could be fatal, and the watchers were patient enough to wait for the smallest crack in vigilance. One night, the fog thickened unusually fast, rolling in from the cliffs with the speed and intent of a living tide. Shadows moved within it in patterns I had never seen before, slithering along the edges of the lighthouse, pausing just beyond the beam of the lantern, testing the limits of the light. The scraping beneath the hatch evolved into a complex rhythm, almost conversational, a counting of my breaths and steps that made every motion deliberate. The watchers were assessing not only my obedience but my endurance, my capacity to remain attentive under pressure, and the resilience of my resolve. I could feel the fog pressing in on every side, curling into the corners, swirling around my ankles, brushing against my skin with the consciousness that was impossible to ignore. Even the wind seemed to carry intent, its howl punctuating the rhythm of the scraping beneath the hatch. Shadows elongated and twisted with deliberate patience, seeming to imitate my own movements, mirroring my pacing and gestures. I understood fully then that the watchers had learned not just observation, but adaptation. They had studied me, learned my habits, and were now testing the limits of my adherence to the 13th Rule. The flame above became my anchor, my tether, and my focus. I moved with the precision of a man who understood that every lapse could be my last. Each rotation of the lens, each trim of the wick, each careful inspection was an act of communion with the lighthouse, the rules, and the unseen intelligence pressing from below and beyond the fog. I realized that the 13th Rule demanded more than physical diligence. It demanded mental discipline, psychological endurance, and an unshakable understanding of the covenant that bound the keepers to the flame, the watchers, and the fog. On one particularly harrowing night, I felt the fog swirl into shapes that were almost human, almost familiar, moving in synchronization with the scraping beneath the hatch. They paused at the windows as if watching me, as if testing the weight of my concentration. I pressed my hands to the railing, heart hammering, and felt the tension of centuries of keepers echo through me. The watchers were not mindless. They were intelligent, deliberate, and unyielding. The rules were not suggestions. They were lifelines. Rule 13, the 13th Rule, was the ultimate test of all. Renner's words echoed in my mind. The flame is not just light, it is life. The watchers learn quickly, but the covenant of the flame is stronger if your mind is steady. I felt my mind stretch to its limits, resisting the whispers in the fog, the pressure of shapes outside the lantern's beam, the rhythmic, almost musical, tapping beneath the hatch. Each night became a battle not of strength but of will. Fatigue was constant. Hunger and thirst were minor obstacles. But the mental strain, the psychological pressure, and the necessity of perfect obedience tested every fiber of my being. I began to notice that the watchers were adapting in ways that were almost imperceptible. The fog would retreat slightly when I faltered, giving the impression of opportunity, only to surge back with greater force moments later. Shadows mirrored gestures I had made hours before, replaying them in a slow, deliberate mockery. The scraping beneath the hatch followed a more complex rhythm, responding to my reactions, almost as if trying to learn, to anticipate, to prepare for the moment I might fail. I understood fully that the 13th Rule was not about tending the flame. It was about understanding vigilance itself, about living within the rhythm of the lighthouse and its guardians, about becoming part of the covenant, rather than merely following it. Even in the deepest exhaustion, I learned to listen to the fog, to feel the pulse of the watchers beneath the hatch, and to anticipate their movements. The flame became more than light. It was a tether, a boundary, a covenant that I had to uphold with every breath, every heartbeat, every thought. One misstep could have been fatal. One lapse could have allowed the watchers to breach the fragile line, but adherence, discipline, and communion with the flame gave me a fragile sense of control. I realized then that Rule 13 demanded more than obedience. It demanded total integration with the purpose of the lighthouse, the rhythm of the watchers, and the intelligence that dwelled in the fog and beneath the hatch. The nights grew relentless. The fog pressed against the lighthouse like liquid stone, thick and deliberate, curling around the spiral stairs and slipping beneath doors and shutters with impossible patience. The scraping beneath the hatch had evolved into a constant, unyielding rhythm, a counting of my heartbeats, a measure of my attention. Shapes in the fog glided along the cliffs, twisting and elongating, almost mocking my meticulous movements. I could feel the watchers watching, learning, and testing. The 13th Rule was no longer a guideline. It was the covenant that kept my life intact, the only tether to sanity and survival. One night, a particularly violent storm raged over the cliffs, wind and rain hammering the lighthouse with ferocity. The fog thickened to near impenetrable density, pressing against the windows like the weight of unseen hands. Shadows moved with deliberate intent, stretching across the glass in eerie, impossible forms. The scraping beneath the hatch intensified, staccato and urgent, synchronized with the pulse of the storm. I climbed the spiral stairs with every ounce of strength, hands gripping the railing, eyes fixed on the rotating flame above. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and measured, a dance with forces older than time itself. The fog seemed almost alive that night, responding to my every motion. It formed tendrils that reached toward the lantern, curling around the base, pressing against the lens, as if testing the strength of the light. Whispers emerged, clearer than ever, forming fragmented sentences that were almost intelligible, repeating phrases I had spoken hours before. My mind strained to resist the temptation to answer, to acknowledge the intelligence pressing against my senses. Each heartbeat was a negotiation, each breath a ritual of survival, and every flicker of the flame a testament to my adherence to the 13th Rule. At one point I felt a presence behind me, heavier than the fog itself. I spun around but saw nothing, only the shadows twisted in unnatural patterns, following me in mimicry. The scraping beneath the hatch shifted, almost impatiently, as if it had detected a hesitation. I pressed my palms to the railing, forcing my heartbeat to slow, focusing on the flame. The watchers were relentless, intelligent, patient. They could wait centuries for a lapse, a misstep, a single faltering moment. And I understood with chilling clarity that the 13th Rule was more than tending a light. It was the total integration of my mind, my body, and my attention with the covenant of the lighthouse itself. The night seemed endless. Shapes in the fog became bolder, almost testing the line of light with every movement. The scraping beneath the hatch became a complex, rhythmic message, a language I could not decipher but could feel in every fiber of my being. The storm's wind carried intent, howling in harmony with the unseen intelligence below. Each rotation of the lantern lens became more crucial than the last, each adjustment of the wick more vital than a heartbeat. The watchers, the fog, and the hatch were all part of a single consciousness, assessing, observing, and demanding perfection. Exhaustion gnawed at me, but I could not falter. Sleep was a temptation that would have been fatal. Hunger and thirst were minor annoyances compared to the relentless pressure pressing from all sides. The 13th Rule required not only vigilance, but communion with the flame, the fog, and the watchers. Each night was a test of endurance, a negotiation with forces that existed beyond comprehension. Each lapse could undo centuries of careful balance. I realized that survival was no longer about following instructions. It was about becoming one with the lighthouse, the flame, and the rhythm of vigilance itself. As the storm reached its apex, I climbed to the top of the spiral stairs, hands slick with rain and sweat, eyes locked on the rotating flame. The fog pressed in close. The scraping beneath the hatch became urgent and precise, and the shadows stretched along the walls with deliberate awareness. I understood then that the 13th Rule was not simply a matter of obedience. It was survival, communion, and understanding. The watchers, the fog, and the hatch were patient, intelligent, and relentless. The flame was my anchor, my tether, and my covenant. One lapse, one faltering moment, and everything could have been lost. By the first light of dawn, the storm had passed and the fog had receded, though its presence lingered like a breath on my skin. The scraping beneath the hatch slowed, deliberate, patient, almost contemplative. The 13th Rule had held. The flame burned steadily, unwavering, a testament to endurance, vigilance, and understanding. I realized then that the rule was more than instructions. It was life itself, a covenant older than memory. And the watchers, patient and calculating, had acknowledged my obedience. The lighthouse was safe, the boundary intact, and I had survived another night within the rhythm, the light, and the whispers of the island. The nights following the storm were quiet, but the silence was not comforting. The fog lingered at the edges of the cliffs, curling in slow, deliberate patterns, a patient observer waiting for another opportunity. The scraping beneath the hatch had slowed, but I knew it had not stopped. The watchers were still learning, still assessing, still testing the fragile boundaries of the 13th Rule had held through the storm. But survival was a continuous exercise, not a single triumph. Each night demanded the same discipline, the same vigilance, the same unwavering communion with the lighthouse and its flame. I spent hours studying the fog, watching its subtle movements, listening to its whispers, and feeling the rhythm of the scraping beneath the hatch. It was as though the fog had become an extension of the watcher's consciousness, a living, breathing instrument of observation. Shadows would form in the mist, then dissolve, testing my reactions, gauging my patience, and measuring my endurance. I realized fully that the 13th Rule was not simply about tending the flame. It was about maintaining the fragile balance of awareness, understanding, and obedience required to coexist with forces beyond comprehension. There were nights when the whispers in the fog became almost human, forming phrases that were half recognizable, repeating words I had spoken aloud, or calling the names of keepers long vanished. Each time I resisted the instinct to respond, I felt a faint pulse of acknowledgement, a silent recognition from the watchers that my focus remained unbroken. Each lapse, no matter how small, would have been disastrous. The 13th Rule demanded absolute integration, a merging of mind, body, and spirit with the rhythm of the lighthouse, the flame, and the unseen intelligence pressing from below and beyond the fog. One night, a cold wind carried a distinct scent of brine and decay, and the fog thickened as if responding to the scent itself. Shapes in the mist moved closer to the lighthouse, gliding just beyond the light, curling around the windows in deliberate arcs. The scraping beneath the hatch became urgent and patterned, almost communicative. I ascended the spiral stairs to the lantern, hands gripping the railing, eyes locked on the flame. The rhythm of the watchers, the fog, and the storm outside became intertwined with my own heartbeat. I understood fully then that the 13th Rule required more than obedience. It required becoming part of the covenant itself, a living conduit of vigilance and restraint. The flame burned steadily, unwavering, a beacon not for sailors, but for the fragile line between life and the intelligence beneath the waves. I felt the pressure of centuries of keepers, the weight of those who had walked this path before me, and the enduring covenant that bound the lighthouse, the flame, the fog, and the watchers together. One faltering moment, one lapse in focus, could unravel the fragile balance. Yet the flame endured. I tended it with deliberate care, each movement a ritual, each breath a meditation, each glance a reaffirmation of the covenant that kept the watchers at bay. By the end of that long night, I realized that the 13th Rule was not merely a commandment. It was life itself on Eel's Spine Island. The watchers, patient and intelligent, had tested me, and I had survived. The fog, though still present, seemed to recede slightly, as if acknowledging my discipline. The scraping beneath the hatch slowed, precise and measured, a silent nod to my adherence. I felt a fragile sense of harmony, the delicate balance of survival, vigilance, and understanding that the 13th Rule demanded. As dawn broke, spilling pale light across the cliffs and revealing the still shivering fog, I remained at the top of the spiral stairs, hands on the railing, eyes on the lantern, and heart steady. The lighthouse had endured, the flame burned, and the watchers, patient and calculating, had been kept at bay. I knew that each night would bring new tests, new whispers, and new pressure from the fog. But I had learned to move with it, anticipate it, and respect it. The 13th Rule was my covenant, my lifeline, and the enduring connection between the living and the intelligence that lay hidden beneath the cliffs and within the mist. The flame at the top of Eel's Spine Island had always been more than light. It was a living barrier, a tether to the fragile line that separated life from something older, something patient, something that lurked beneath the cliffs and within the fog. Every flicker, every rotation of the lens, every careful trim of the wick was a negotiation with forces that had waited centuries, invisible and intelligent, testing every action, every hesitation, every moment of inattention. The 13th Rule had become a covenant I could feel in my bones, a rhythm I could not escape, a line I could not cross. It was on the 7th week that I began to understand what the light truly kept away. The fog thickened more aggressively than ever, rolling in from the cliffs like a tide of living gray. Shadows stretched across the glass panes, moving in ways that defied reason, shapes that elongated and twisted in impossible patterns, always just beyond the beam of the lantern. The scraping beneath the hatch had grown into a precise, almost communicative rhythm, marking my every movement, my heartbeat, my very breath. I realized then that the watchers were no longer simply testing my endurance. They were gauging the integrity of the barrier itself, the effectiveness of the flame, the strength of my covenant with the 13th Rule. One night, the fog seemed to thicken into a solid wall, curling along the spiral staircase, pressing against the windows with the weight of consciousness. Shapes within it glided closer, brushing against the edges of the light, testing its reach. I could feel the intelligence behind them, patient and unyielding, observing how I responded to the pressure, cataloging my attention, and preparing for any lapse. The watchers were everywhere and nowhere, present in the scraping beneath the hatch, in the whispers that emerged from the fog, and in the subtle vibrations through the stone floors. The light was the only line of defense, and the 13th Rule was the covenant that allowed it to endure. I began to notice patterns in the watcher's behavior. When the flame burned steadily, the fog recoiled slightly, shadows hesitated at the edges, and the scraping beneath the hatch slowed into a contemplative rhythm. But the moment I faltered, even slightly, a ripple passed through the mist. Shadows elongated with deliberate mockery, and the scraping intensified, urgent and precise. I understood fully then that the light did more than illuminate the cliffs. It repelled, it defined boundaries, It maintained the fragile equilibrium between the living and the intelligence lurking within, and around the lighthouse. It was not merely the watchers beneath the hatch that I had to fear. The fog itself carried intelligence, pressing inward like a living organism, curling around my ankles, brushing against my face, whispering words I could not comprehend. At times, the shadows within it seemed to imitate forms I recognized. Friends, family, past keepers, moving as though testing my attention, trying to gauge whether I would react to familiarity or fear. Each night became a lesson in discipline, a study in restraint, and a negotiation with forces that existed beyond comprehension. The light had to be maintained at all costs, and the 13th rule had to be observed with unwavering focus. One particularly long night, the wind carried a faint, acrid scent of brine and decay, and the fog seemed to thicken into twisting columns around the lighthouse. Shapes moved with a fluid intelligence, curling along the walls and pausing at the windows, as if studying the light itself. The scraping beneath the hatch shifted, staccato and urgent, almost musical, synchronized with the rhythm of the storm. I pressed my hands to the railing, eyes locked on the lantern, and felt the pull of exhaustion threaten to shatter the fragile equilibrium I had maintained. My body ached, my mind strained, yet I understood with absolute clarity that the light was more than protection. It was a covenant of life itself, and the watchers were relentless in testing its endurance. The flame became the center of consciousness, the axis around which every thought, movement, and breath revolved. Shadows pressed close to the glass, tendrils of fog seeking any weakness, but the light held, unwavering. The watchers measured not only the flame but my understanding of it, my integration with the 13th rule, and my ability to maintain vigilance without hesitation. Each night was a delicate negotiation, and I had learned to anticipate the fog, the scraping, the whispers, and the subtle intelligence pressing from below and beyond the cliffs. By the 8th week, the light had become almost an extension of myself. Every rotation of the lens, every careful trimming of the wick, every measured breath was an act of communion with the lighthouse, the watchers, and the unseen intelligence pressing through the fog. I had learned to move with the rhythm, anticipate the pressure, and respect the covenant. The light was not simply a flame, it was the shield and the fragile line that kept the watchers at bay. The 13th rule was not a commandment, but a living ritual, and its preservation was my only path to survival on Eel's Spine Island. The nights on Eel's Spine Island had taken on a rhythm I could no longer escape. The fog was constant, curling and twisting with deliberate intent, its movements echoing the intelligence beneath the hatch and within the cliffs. Shadows pressed against the windows in impossible shapes, elongating, bending, and sometimes appearing almost human, as if testing whether I would flinch or falter. The scraping beneath the hatch had grown complex, evolving into a rhythm that felt almost purposeful, a code I could not fully decipher but instinctively understood. The watchers were learning, adapting, and testing the boundaries of the flame, of the 13th rule, and of my endurance. One night, a storm unlike any I had ever experienced rolled in. The wind tore at the lighthouse, rattling windows, twisting the shutters, and carrying the fog in dense, suffocating waves. Shadows slithered along the glass panes, curling toward the light, pausing to study its reach. The scraping beneath the hatch became urgent and deliberate, almost conversational, as if the watchers were issuing a final test. My hands were slick with rain and sweat as I climbed the spiral stairs, eyes fixed on the flame. Every rotation of the lens, every adjustment of the wick, every careful inspection became an act of defiance, endurance and communion with the covenant I had maintained for weeks. The fog itself seemed to carry intent. It pressed inward like a living thing, brushing against my face, curling around my ankles, and whispering words I could not understand. Shapes within it stretched and twisted, forming fleeting images of keepers long gone, of shadows that seemed almost human, testing whether I would recognize them, whether I would respond. I understood fully then that the light did more than illuminate the cliffs. It repelled, defined, and maintained the fragile equilibrium between life and the intelligence lurking within and beneath the island. One lapse, one faltering glance, one hesitation, and the watchers could breach the line. By the 9th week, I had become hyper-aware of every subtle change in the fog, every variation in the scraping beneath the hatch, every whisper in the darkness. The watchers were relentless, and the light became my anchor, tether, and shield. Shadows would stretch along the walls in deliberate patterns, curling toward the lantern only to retreat when I focused my attention, testing both the reach of the light and my ability to maintain unwavering focus. Each rotation of the lens was a meditation. Each careful trim of the wick was a ritual. I had learned to anticipate the fog, the watchers, and the rhythm beneath the hatch, integrating them into my own consciousness as part of the covenant. One particularly harrowing night, the fog formed dense columns that pressed against the windows and wrapped around the lighthouse in twisting arcs. Shapes moved closer, brushing against the glass as though feeling for weakness, while the scraping beneath the hatch became a rapid staccato rhythm that synced unnervingly with the pounding of my own heart. I gripped the railing, legs trembling, eyes locked on the rotating flame. The watchers were everywhere and nowhere, patient, intelligent, and unyielding. I realized then that the 13th Rule was not simply a command. It was the embodiment of vigilance itself, the covenant that bound the lighthouse, the flame, and the keepers together against the intelligence pressing from below and beyond the fog. The candle burned steadily, an unwavering axis amid chaos. The fog threatened at every angle, shadows testing the light, whispers coaxing me to falter, and the scraping beneath the hatch marking my every move. I understood fully that survival depended on absolute communion with the flame, understanding the watcher's intelligence, and respecting the covenant of the 13th Rule. One misstep, one lapse of attention, and the line between life and oblivion could vanish in an instant. Each breath, each heartbeat, each deliberate adjustment of the lantern was a reaffirmation that the light would endure, that the watchers would be held at bay, and that I would survive another night on Eel's Spine Island. The storm raged on through the night, wind lashing at the lighthouse, fog curling like living fingers, and shadows pressing relentlessly against the windows. The scraping beneath the hatch intensified, sharp and deliberate, an almost musical rhythm that seemed to measure my resolve, testing whether the flame and I could endure. Each rotation of the lens, each careful trim of the wick, each measured breath became a sacred act of survival. The 13th Rule, once a guideline, was now a covenant, a living bond that demanded more than obedience. It demanded integration, vigilance, and unwavering communion with the flame, the watchers, and the intelligence that lurked in the fog. At one point, I felt a presence behind me, heavier than the storm itself, almost palpable in its insistence. I spun around, but nothing was visible, only shadows stretching and bending in unnatural ways, as if imitating my every movement. The scraping beneath the hatch shifted, staccato and urgent, responding to my heartbeat, to the tension in my muscles, and to the faltering of my mind. I pressed my palms to the railing, forcing my focus back to the flame, reminding myself that the light was not merely a guide, but a line of defense, a fragile tether that held the watchers at bay. Any hesitation could invite disaster. The fog seemed to thicken with intent, forming twisting columns that reached toward the lantern, curling and recoiling with deliberate intelligence. Shapes moved along the cliffs, slithering in patterns that defied reason, sometimes pausing at the edge of the light to test its reach. Whispers emerged from the mist, repeating fragments of words I had spoken hours or even days before, a mimicry designed to lure attention or break focus. I resisted every instinct to respond, holding to the rhythm of the flame, letting its rotation, its warmth, and its unwavering glow anchor my mind and body. The watchers were relentless, intelligent, and patient. Hours passed as an endless struggle of vigilance. The wind shrieked, the fog pressed, shadows elongated, and the scraping beneath the hatch punctuated the night like a heartbeat, counting down to a potential lapse. My body screamed for rest. My muscles ached. And yet every fiber of my being was focused on maintaining the light, the covenant, and the fragile line of survival. I became attuned to the rhythm of the watchers, to the pressure of the fog, to the subtle movements of shadows, and the cadence of the scraping. I moved with instinctual precision, each rotation of the lens, each adjustment of the wick, each breath a part of the sacred covenant I had sworn to uphold. As dawn approached, the fog began to recede slightly, pulling back in slow, deliberate motions, and the shadows softened, curling at the edges of the lantern's glow rather than pressing against it. The scraping beneath the hatch slowed to a contemplative rhythm, almost as though the watchers were acknowledging my endurance, my adherence to the 13th Rule, and the integrity of the light. I lowered myself onto the railing, heart still pounding, hands trembling, and felt a fragile sense of harmony settle over the lighthouse. The watchers had been held at bay, the covenant had been maintained, and the light remained a barrier against the intelligence pressing from below and beyond the fog. By the 9th week, I realized that the light was more than survival. It was understanding. It was communion with forces beyond comprehension, a fragile line of defense maintained through vigilance, patience, and discipline. Shadows would always stretch, whispers would always test, and the scraping beneath the hatch would continue. But the candle flame, steady and unwavering, had become a living covenant between the keepers and the watchers, between life and the unknown. The 13th Rule had not merely been observed, it had been embodied. The light endured, and I endured with it. Standing at the top of the spiral stairs as the first pale light of morning touched the cliffs, I understood fully what the flame kept away. It was not merely the fog, nor the shadows, nor the intelligence beneath the hatch. It was the collapse of order, the surrender of vigilance, and the letting go of the covenant. The watchers, patient and calculating, had been repelled not by force but by obedience, focus, and unwavering discipline. The light had maintained its boundary, and in doing so, preserved life, sanity, and the fragile balance that had existed on Eel's Spine Island for centuries. The sun rose slowly over Eel's Spine Island, spilling pale gold light across jagged cliffs and revealing the lingering mist of night. The fog had retreated, but its presence was still palpable, a reminder of the intelligence that had tested me, observed me, and pressed against the boundaries of the lighthouse. The scraping beneath the hatch had quieted, leaving only the faintest echo, a pulse that reminded me the watchers had not vanished. They were patient, persistent, and eternal. The light had survived, the covenant had endured, and I had come through another night unbroken. For the first time, I allowed myself a moment to look around, to see the lighthouse in full, to sense the rhythm of the surroundings that had become my life. Every stone, every plank, every lens of glass felt alive, infused with the memory of keepers who had come before and the watchers who had always waited. The flame at the top rotated steadily, unwavering, a beacon that not only kept the unknown at bay, but preserved a fragile order older than memory. I understood fully that the light was not merely fire and glass. It was the heartbeat of the covenant, the fragile line between the known and the unknowable. I descended the spiral stairs slowly, each step deliberate, my senses attuned to the lingering pressure of the fog and the quiet rhythm beneath the hatch. The watchers had not abandoned their vigilance, and I could feel their intelligence pressing gently, patiently, like a tide that ebbs and flows with imperceptible timing. The whispers had faded to murmurs, shadows retreated to the cliffs. But the lesson of the 13th Rule remained clear. Survival was a covenant, maintained not by power but by discipline, attention, and communion with the flame. As I reached the base of the lighthouse, I gazed out over the cliffs, feeling the pulse of the island itself beneath my feet. The waves crashed against jagged rocks, spraying mist into the morning air, and I could see the fog curling at the edges of the cliffs, still patient, still waiting. The watchers had not gone. They never would. But I had learned to move with them, to anticipate their movements, to respect their presence while maintaining the fragile equilibrium that allowed the lighthouse to endure. The 13th Rule had become instinct, a rhythm within me as vital as breathing, and the flame above had become a living extension of that covenant. Throughout the day, I maintained the flame, checking the wick, rotating the lens, observing the horizon, and listening to the faint echoes beneath the hatch. The watchers watched, the fog shifted, and the light endured. I realized that life on Eel Spine Island was not merely survival. It was an ongoing ritual, a constant negotiation, a dialogue of attention and understanding with forces beyond comprehension. The flame was my anchor, the watchers my challenge, and the 13th Rule my guide. To maintain it was to live. To falter was to invite oblivion. By nightfall, a new mist crept across the cliffs, thinner than before, less insistent, yet deliberate. Shadows moved just beyond the lantern's beam, and the scraping beneath the hatch resumed its subtle rhythm. I climbed the spiral stairs once more, hands gripping the railing, eyes on the flame, and heart steady. The light rotated steadily above me, unwavering, a testament to endurance, vigilance, and understanding. The watchers tested, but I endured. The covenant had held, and the lighthouse had survived. I understood finally what the flame kept away. It was not merely shapes in the fog or the whispers beneath the hatch. It was the collapse of focus, the surrender of vigilance, the letting go of the covenant that preserved life and sanity. The watchers, patient, calculating, and eternal, had been held at bay not by force, but by understanding, discipline, and communion. The light endured, the 13th Rule had been obeyed, and the fragile line between the known and the unknown remained intact. As dawn broke fully over the cliffs, I remained at the top of the spiral stairs, eyes locked on the lantern, breathing in the salt air, feeling the pulse of the island beneath my feet, and understanding with complete clarity that the covenant of the lighthouse, the flame, and the watchers was eternal. Life on Eel Spine Island demanded vigilance, patience, and understanding. The watchers would never rest, the fog would never cease, and the 13th Rule would always be the line that separated the living from the intelligence lurking beneath and beyond the cliffs. And so the flame burned, steady and unwavering, and I kept watch, knowing that in its light lay the fragile boundary between existence and oblivion. The watchers retreated into the fog, patient and calculating, but I had endured. The lighthouse remained, the covenant held, and the light continued its eternal vigil, keeping the watchers at bay, preserving life, and guarding the secret that only the flame could hold.